I want to start then with the problématique, or the problem that we are sort of facing. The problem we're facing with evaluation, I think worldwide, and I come from Canada, so probably have a North American perspective of sorts, have done work in various continents and in various contexts, so I think I sense the issues worldwide. I do teach at the IPDET program, the International Program for Development and Evaluation Training for World Bank, so I get some perspective on this. And I think it's fair to say that what we often see is a disconnect between evaluation and real policy. And again, we had some questions and discussion of this morning, but evaluations can sometimes be seen as either not completely relevant or not timely enough, or not speaking to the key questions of policy that people need in the time frame that they're needed. And with the kind of insight that I think is truly needed in various ways, shapes, and forms. The other tendency we see is that evaluation, like any other function, can sometimes be segregated into a specific unit or set of units, which may be somewhat disengaged from other corporate management functions or other management functions altogether. So this can be problematic as well, because if we're looking to see, for example, whether our strategies are working or our plans are executing as we would expect, it's not easy if those functions are so separated that they're sort of not linked or coordinated with each other. This can now sometimes lead to issues that we find in terms of people being a little misguided in terms of how they're doing evaluations. What we've seen, maybe I'll just let that go by rather than compete. Speaking of disconnects. Now we'll reconnect. What we've sometimes seen is that people will follow different paths of importance or priorities with evaluations than might be suited for the real need at hand. There is a tendency to talk about following the money. Indeed, evaluation started in this way, where it was looking at transfer payments. This is why it's so much more developed sometimes in the development community than it is in other parts of the community, because people were, after all, looking to see whether the money they had spent had made a difference. But this, of course, biases evaluation a little bit towards the direct transfer payment process and looking at whether that's making the difference as compared to broader policy areas, regulations, international law, all manner of initiatives that might take place which might have equal or even greater import in terms of making a difference in some of the policy areas we're looking at. So there's sometimes been a tendency for evaluation to be done in silos and done against certain types of policy instruments or certain types of initiatives as compared to others. Well, you know, when that happens, nature abhors a vacuum, as my dad was a physics teacher, and so he notes this, and so do humans, and they'll fill it with whatever's available. So the cruel irony is that we might have somewhat, it may not be great, but some evaluation evidence on some things about whether they're working, time after time after time, and literally no evidence on other things, which might be of equal importance or great value. I mean, regulatory frameworks, for example, worldwide, be it in trade policy or environment or human rights, etc., can have profound, as you know well, effects on what's going on in any given jurisdiction or constituency. And yet, real evaluations of some of those are few and far between. And yet, we've evaluated to death some minute programs that have, you know, been about training some people to do some small thing in agriculture. I mean, I don't mean to put that down at all. I just mean to say, how many times do we have to say, well, we've trained these people, they've learned how to do this, but there's no market for this product. You know, it's not going to work. And if we looked at a more broad contextualized framework for the policy, we might have some insight as to how to do this better. So the limited solutions we've seen to date have not worked either. And these are things like big ticket evaluations on the same minutiae of areas. And so we end up being with what some of us call the randomistas, who say, well, you have to do a proper evaluation, and that means you must do a random control trial or something with scientific rigor. And here's the rub about that. Once we decide that we've got to have something with scientific rigor, and of course I'm Canadian, so that means I have a large big brother, partner, trade partner, whatever it might be south of my border, who influences me greatly. And the influence from that large partner tends to be around this design rigor thinking, which and in fact they institutionalized this some years ago under actually President Bush, where they suggested that it was not proper evaluation unless it had had some kind of scientific design. That is scary, ladies and gentlemen, because what that means is we're going to know more and more about less and less, as people would say. More and more about the specific interventions out of context and without a strategic framework to make reference to. More and more about things that in fact are still complex, and in fact we probably still don't really know the answers to because we haven't looked at the bigger contextual situation. At the other extreme, one finds that people will try and simplify things to a scorecard. The key performance indicators, which end up in some people's minds as being the vital few that we can tell the worth of a program by. And of course the problem with that is it misses all the bits that tell me how I'm making a difference, for whom and why. It tells me oftentimes about the very highest level indicator, whether it be around, again, health indexes or trade performance, economic performance, again, poverty, or again, various measures at the community or at the society level of misery, if you want to look at it at one side, or wealth and development on the other. And then of course, it makes what one of my colleagues likes to call a quantum leap in logic between that and the small initiatives we have in that area. Again, being virtually meaningless in terms of a learning game for how we're making a difference for whom and why. And so the third point on this is this methods-driven thinking. There is no clear method that will work in all purposes, for all situations. What we need is first rigorous thinking before rigorous methods, and that's what I want to really speak about. The three keys then, to my mind, to making better evaluation that's more useful, more valid, more learning oriented, will be to clarify what it is we're evaluating, clarify the evaluand, will be to tailor the approach to what it is we want to know for whom and why, and to position evaluation as a learning function very clearly. That does not discount its role as an accountability function or as a test of value for money or any of the other myriad purposes. But I would contend that if we don't have learning in evaluation, then we've missed the point. We've really missed the ball completely. Well, let's start with the first one, clarifying that evaluand. So what information is being sought by this evaluation truly? Why and who wants to know? What do we need to measure to obtain this information? Often, and again this came up in some of the conversation this morning, and in terms of when and how it will be used, we need to know this because we are thinking about either policy changes or program changes, or in some cases project changes. So if we know, for example, that things have made or have not made a difference at the aggregate level, that may or may not tell us anything about some of the key contemplated changes that we have. It will also not explain why they're working, and of course whether they should continue to be supported. So they often miss the boat completely when they're, again, either too simple-minded on the indicators, or when they wait for a random control trial or for some scientific design some long time after the fact to tell them that on margin within this confidence level, yes or no. What do you do with that? Again, especially when the situation has changed sufficiently that it may be a completely different world. And for those of you in the development community, you know exactly what I mean. For those of you in any world, you know what I mean. You know, a few years to months, the whole situation can change, as we see, just about anywhere you look. So it's critical to have these issues clarified, the issues of what we want to know for whom and why, to know who the beneficiaries are, what they really want. For the commissioners of the evaluation, can they clarify what it is we're looking at for all parties and be consistent in terms of why we're doing this? And again, let's not kid ourselves at the highest level, and if we're in an area of austerity or restraint, then we need to know, because there may be efficiencies we're looking for. That has to be honest and open. On the other hand, it may be for improvement. It may be to question the wisdom of a certain strategy or set of strategies compared to others, and we need to be clear about that too, or it may be both of those. And if that's true, that's fine. Let's just be clear about it. We need to check what the evaluation is with all parties, including, again, those commissioning and all those using, and those who are, let's call it, the targets of the evaluation. So let's talk about the three keys to the approach that I would see changing that might be important. Going with issues, the use of theory, and the use of evidence, or the generation and use of evidence. So with issues, what I would see is the following. Less aggregates, averages, summary, efficiency, effectiveness, and simple-minded value for money types of questions. The black and white, did we have value for money? Were we efficient? Were we effective? I know those ring simplistically well with some parties out there, but I mean big or small p parties out there, but they don't tell us very much, and in fact they can be grossly misleading. As I mentioned earlier in previous sessions, the aggregates and averages can bury a lot of problems, in fact make things look rosier than they should be or worse than they should be in terms of whether we're really reaching the right groups, whether the mechanisms we are interested in knowing about are working or not, and whether we've, for example, given it enough time in the life cycle to see change. We answer none of those when we look at aggregates and averages. It tends towards simple-mindedness that says, well, more is better. Again, think about that. If we're trying to create awareness around certain phenomena in our society, be it mistreatment of certain groups, be it, again, human rights infractions, be it, again, systematic biases, what a program might do in the short run is reveal more of these. Why? Because it's done its job. It's created more awareness. It's gotten people to understand what those are and gotten them to report on that. That's okay. In fact, that's critical to making the difference. And yet that will show a trajectory and performance that might look bad in the short run. So we've got to be more thinking about what it is we want for whom and why. And we can't just simply focus on value for money. Where should we go? We should look further at relevance. Is this program truly relevant to the need and situation at hand? Is it something that is, again, part of a bigger strategy, or should be? Or is it in and of itself sufficient? Of course, it's rarely the latter. It's usually part of a much bigger picture. And we need to reference it as such and recognize that. We need to try to see what value and what works, to what extent, for whom and in what conditions and why. And for those of you out there who recognize this, I'll start quoting Ray Poston in a few minutes. But that's the kind of question that I found can actually change the game when it comes to people's thinking about what the evaluation is going to do. In other words, it gets it away from yes or no, good or bad, efficient or not, effective or not, and it gets people to say, okay, yeah, in those conditions and contexts it works, in those it doesn't. How can we improve? If we can get people on that road, I think we can make this a much more constructive dialogue when it comes to evaluation, not only reporting, but every piece of the process. I like a guy named John Owen very much. This may be difficult to read for all of you in the room, but I'll just refer to it in terms of his sorting of the reasons you would do evaluation, the orientation of it, and the typical issues and approaches. What I typically do with my students in Canada is, and most of these are already practitioners in terms of evaluators, is to ask them where most of the questions they currently face reside on this framework. And most of them end up discussing it in terms of the right-hand side, something along the impact side. Has the program been implemented as planned? Have the stated goals been achieved? Have the needs of those served been achieved? I'm not even sure they get there. Unintended outcomes often not there. But a few of these right-hand side things get asked and answered. Very few of the things on the left-hand side, which in many respects can be the deeper questions. Is there a true need for this? What is recognized as maybe not best practice, I have a problem with that, but maybe good or appropriate practice for this area, and so on. And so we as evaluators and users of evaluation need to recognize that there are many, many reasons to do this kind of work, and we need to start with appropriate questions that are circumspect enough, that are not too black and white, and that are therefore not summative and normative, but rather maybe descriptive and exploratory. And I think that starts us off on the right foot. And that leads me to Ray Poston and Poston and Tilley's work in realist evaluation. As I mentioned this morning, there are some 7 questions here, the first of which seems trivial when you read it as a non-evaluator. But if you've done a few of these, it made me shake my head looking at it, saying, how is the program supposed to work? Seems like everyone should know that. But of course, more often than not, most people don't see it the same way. They've got completely different agendas. And I know in fact, I've tested this. I go with a sort of crude level logic model to people as part of my interview guide, and I've had, in a fair percentage of cases, people go, oh, I don't recognize this. That's not what I think this is about. And right off the bat you go, you know, how can we be so silly and arrogant as to assume the same agenda for everybody at the table, or even assume the same understanding whether they have the same agenda or not? I love some of these other ones too, because they get subtly at systems thinking without, again, forcing people through all the myriad models and diagrams. It gets people to talk about the reasoned reactions of stakeholders. Are they different? You can look at the implementation chain, and I think this is particularly important for some of you in this room. The implementation chain, is it applied consistently and sort of cumulatively or not? And how does it deviate? How does it bend in implementation? I love this one. How does it bend in actual usage? Because we're all human beings here. We're not automatons. This is not a robotic situation. We'll get to this in a minute. They always bend. How do they bend? And in what ways? And why? Often the workarounds are more interesting than the direct work. Why are they working around? What else is not working here? Of course, the contextual influences, which are critical, is number 5. Does it fare better with particular individuals, interpersonal relations, institutions, and infrastructures? Again, so key. And in fact explains, in my experience, so much. Yet we've often missed this at our peril. You know, the history of the program is another good one. I can't tell you how many times we've said, well, this program has come on the heels of several other programs that looked like this. You were expecting it to now look like that. But they're all thinking it looks like this because you cut that program. So they saw this other pot of money and thought it was for the same thing. And so on. And just the history of the relationships. If we're expecting a huge transformation overnight between certain parties when certain things happen, we may be kidding ourselves. And then finally, this last one is subtle but really important over time. The multiple unintended long-term effects. Is it self-affirming or self-defeating or self-neutralizing? And of course, this, many would contend, is the dependency syndrome sometimes in some cases, or the fix that fails, where you put an emphasis, for example, on risk and on managing these risks, and suddenly it becomes important not to have those risks, so people start hiding them. So the exact opposite of what you wanted. So these are all kind of questions that are subtle. I would contend our systems types of thinking are not that complicated to ask, and yet bring up so much when we actually do the study. Now let's move to results logics. How could that change? I think we need fewer and less linear, one-way, unexplained, context-absent box and wire diagrams. And I'm sorry if it's implicating anyone here. I'm as guilty as anyone here. You know, we used to do these marvels of Cartesian logic when we'd start. With many, many boxes and everything. You'd be so proud of yourself, you know. And I can remember you'd show this to the client or the project authority or the line manager, and the eyes would glaze over, yeah? And they go, oh yeah, okay. And then you go away, you do your study, you come back, have your findings. They go, where the heck did you come up with this? And you go, well, it's box C49 in my logic chain. You know, we had some for regional development that would have blown your mind. They looked like the wiring diagram for a nuclear submarine. It was unbelievable. And you know, and so we've got to stop that. We're not doing these for ourselves. We're not doing this to prove how smart we are. We're doing this to communicate and to have people communicate with us about what it is works with whom and why. So let's again find the models, find the way of depicting the reality that works. Maybe that's just in verbal, maybe that's just in language. Maybe it's not even a diagram at all. But we need to find ways to do it better. We need to situate, describe the systems that are in play. We need to describe the theories of implementation as well as of change, and I'll get to that in a minute. And we need to have them understood by everybody involved, and I'll get to examples in a minute of that. This is a frame that I've been trying to use lately to kind of get at that. To think about the contextual factors on the left-hand side of this diagram, we're suggesting that there may be some broad ones, the socio-economic, political, technological, and environmental factors that affect all of us. Historical factors, they are the overarching sort of impacts. The things like, again, economic up or downturn, the world political or environmental events that may occur. They will affect us without question. They're not something we can in any way control, but they are in fact very important to the story every time, and we again ignore these at our peril. There are factors related to the intervention type, and this I find most interesting, and I've mentioned this before, but in this book I like very much by Sue Funnell and Patricia Rogers called Purposeful Program Theory, they talk about archetypes of programs. So archetypes being in Vedang and others, many of the European evaluators have led the thinking on this in terms of carrot, sticks, and sermons. Vedang and Ray Rist from the World Bank and others have written on this. So carrots, of course, incentive programs, we bribe people to do things. Sermons, we tell people they should, we give them maybe information. And of course sticks, we're providing deterrence through penalties and so on. We don't think much of it, and they're often hybrids. Some of my class jokingly talk about carrot sticks. I don't know if any of you have young children, but sometimes they like the carrot. Anyway, these, that they can look like a carrot, but they're really a stick, or vice versa. The point being is, what kind of incentives do they make in trying to invoke this theory of change? How do they operate? And each of them have their own set of conditions and factors that we found over time are important for them to work. And it's important we bring that to the table as well. I've rarely seen people bring that kind of research and thinking to the table in terms of, okay, this is a granting program for companies who are, if they do well, expected to pay some of this back. Our experience in Canada is that repayable contributions have rarely worked well. They've been an absolute disaster in many, many cases. And there are a bunch of reasons for it. And interestingly, over 20, 30 years, that bunch of reasons can add up and be consistently codified, such that you can start to see, such that they've never worked well. So repayable contributions have plenty of truisms that need to be in place. I won't go through all of them, but you see what I'm getting at, such that, again, we keep trying them because it sounds like a good idea. If the government pays a company something, they should get that money back. The problem is, when it's a contribution, the type of rules around it, et cetera, have often been in play to have them not work. The same with certain deterrents. I'll talk about administrative monetary penalties in the afternoon session today, and how we found year after year and program after program they've delivered less than expected for some various reasons. And outcome-based standards in terms of regulatory controls can be very problematic. And interestingly, very problematic across different sectors. In other words, the nature of these incentives or deterrents or information programs actually carry with them some key factors that you must pay attention to. They should be in your assumptions and your factors. And you need to look at them as a sort of checklist almost. The same with engagement and relationship factors. We talked this morning about the nature of different relationships. Is this group a regulated party to you? Are they truly a partner? And as we talked about it, that sort of plastic term is usually not the case. They're usually somebody we want to cooperate or coordinate with, but not truly partner with. If that's true, then we need to be clear about that. Usually those roles need to be mutually understood, and we need to have some clarity around the conditions and the information and the communication and so on. So there are relationship factors that come into play. And then, of course, the bottom of this picture are the management and governance factors. Often we know those all too well through audit and review functions. We tend to do the bottom one extensively. We tend to miss some of the others in terms of recognized assumptions and factors. And that's key, ladies and gentlemen, because you might, for example, and we've seen this many times in innovation programming, get very negative on one of our best innovation programs was the Industrial Research Assistance Program. Was there to help small businesses with innovation. They would always get hammered by the audit for not having a good control regime. And of course, a lot of this was because they were being very flexible and nimble, as one must be with small businesses in innovation circumstances. I mean, that program has been copied by countries like Ireland and others who went to high success. But it was there because it chose relationship factors and looked at the nature of that sector in terms of the broad context and chose that those were more important than being sort of slavishly governed by rules that would have taken 6 months to make a payment and that kind of thing. Small businesses can't wait 6 months or a year. You need to make it now, and so you need conditions around that. There was no more fraud or any other things that audit would catch than there was in any other program. It was just different conditions. So we need to contextualize all of these things, look at them as the vital context for the delivery design and the policy instrument, and that's the next bit. We need to recognize that how we deliver fundamentally is linked to the instrument itself. So if we have again an incentive program for not-for-profits or for companies or for civil society folks or others to do something, how we deliver it is as important as the theory of change itself. So again, if we think that we're going to educate people such that they will either do better agriculture or they will be able to take care of themselves or their communities or their children better, well, that may work. How have we delivered it? Through intermediary parties, more often than not, or with several other groups who may have their own agendas in play and may, again, bend the delivery, as per Poston's question 3 or 4, And how does that work with regard to the influence itself? What I found all too often is that we model that top bit somewhat well, not always great. We often take the other bit for granted, that we're going to deliver through this group, or this is going to happen. When all of the things around relationships and around these other factors actually apply to this as well as to that. So it could look, if one was looking at a pathway in a double system, and I'm hoping this is again recognizable. When we did the survey this morning, most people have seen log frames or logic models, so this should look very familiar. The gray zone is the intermediary logic chain, and it goes out of your control rather quickly. As you can see, we're talking about reaching those intermediaries having the capacity to carry out the will, and the will to carry this out, to have behaviors themselves that do so, and then to create this enabling environment, which changes due to the intermediary's actions. This is, I'm taking directly from something that John Main and Nancy Johnson are putting out very shortly, Main being sort of the father of contribution analysis, which we'll talk about later today. This is sort of very recent, and I'm appreciative that he's done this because I've been sort of harping on it for some years, that we need to look at a gray chain as well as this white chain, which tends to be, okay, once the recipients have been reached in some way, now what has been their capacity change, and how has it affected them, and what have been the impacts. So again, all too often I find as evaluators, we've come in sort of from the right-hand side, looked at this white chain, and then explained things through the gray. But why couldn't we look at modeling that side as well? And on top of that, why couldn't we look at learning over time about what works? As I mentioned earlier, repayable contributions. That's more in the intermediaries sometimes, because we're talking about groups that work with other groups. Or the so-called triple P partnership, the public-private partnership to deliver. Those are delivery arrangements, ladies and gentlemen, that have their own nuances and good sort of strengths and weaknesses. Do they always create the enabling environment such that you reach the right groups? The moment we go to private delivery agents, let's be clear, and if they have profit motive, does it change who they reach? My experience is often it does, because there are profitable groups to reach and there are less profitable groups to reach. And if we have a public and private delivery agent, and if they're operating in the same environment, then who gets left to the public delivery and who's done by the private? Do we have the skimming? I mean, these are classics, and there are many, many more that we can talk about by looking at the interplay of the reach and engagement of the intermediaries and the reach and engagement of the target. Just that alone could be useful, and we don't model it currently. So, this is what I'm proposing. We need to start with the broad contextual factors, the factors around the nature of the instruments itself and the initiatives themselves, the engagement and relationship factors, which I almost can't emphasize enough as being so key, and then of course management and governance, and then look at the results logic in this sort of at least bifurcated way. On the right-hand side, we also have to have clear definitions of what we mean by success, which means let's not go so highfalutin that we're going to change the world. Let's look at realistic changes that we think that this relationship will make them as concrete as we can. And then let's look at specific observations around what has worked in the cases at hand. What works for whom and what conditions and why. Again, embrace context and look at it as part of what John Main will call a causal package. That within all of these contextual factors and with these delivery arrangements, this theory of change works for these groups in this way. Wouldn't that be so much more useful? And imagine, ladies and gentlemen, if it could be generative, if we could systematically do this so that we would learn over time where education and training on the ground work and where it doesn't. It would help policymakers, it would help designers as well as evaluators. So finally, the third key would be the lines of evidence that we would use. Fewer standardized approaches ranked by some predetermined hierarchy of value, i.e. if it's not a scientific design, it's not worth anything. Let's disavow ourselves of that. In a context-rich environment such as we live, in a complex environment such as we operate in, which I think anytime we have this many groups of human beings working together or at odds, it's a complex environment. Then we cannot, again, be slaves to some concept that there's a hierarchy of design rigor. And then, so rather than worship that, look at not studies that, by the way, would then almost necessarily be done by the cloistered few, because people who can do random control trials or advanced econometrics tend to be fairly specialized and therefore disconnected from what's really going on. Let's do more flexible, adapted, integrated measures and approaches, integrating the M and the E, so to speak, the monitoring and the evaluation, looking at those together through some consistent type of theory of change, looking at drawing a diversity of sources. And interestingly, to my mind, the diversity of sources is the diversity of people around it, as well as the diversity of types of evidence. What I mean by that is a lot of people like to say, oh, I use multiple lines of evidence. I did a survey, I did interviews, I did focus groups. That's great. If you did them with the same people, that's not so diverse, right? In fact, it's probably groupthink by now. And then on top of this, we need meta-accumulation and applied use of the knowledge so that we could learn and share together what is working for whom and with whom and why. In a non-threatening way. These questions are less threatening than sort of good or bad, value or no value. The beauty of the questions that I'm suggesting is that people will feel less threatened and therefore be more inclined to share what they're learning. And that's really, really important. So to my mind, the last point is to position evaluation as a learning function. Create a lens and a language for learning by some of the things that we're proposing here and what I've been talking about this morning and this afternoon. Make it integral to all public management functions. In other words, not something done after the fact or on the side to justify or to reduce a program, but rather something that we would be looking forward to in terms of a learning experience. Wouldn't that be nice to have managers saying, I'm looking forward to the evaluation. We have a few, but all too few. Yeah, that'll be my indicator. What's the engagement or reaction, right, that I'm seeing from managers in that regard? And that, all public policy instruments should be considered. And by that I mean that, if we're providing a particular incentive program, are we also looking at it in the context of what the regulatory framework is and what the other initiatives are and what historical context has meant and so on. And then evaluators therefore become facilitators, educators in some respects. And what I mean is not tell people about their program, but get them to think about it in a different way. The how, who, what, why. A framing for their performance story. And people are marvelous at telling you that story if you offer them something that they can really work with. That's what we need to do, is offer them things they can work with. And then be therefore the synthesis, as well as the synthesizer, as well as the analyst. As Ackoff says, the synthesis starts with the big picture framework and then goes to the detail. The analyst breaks things down and then tries to sum it up. We do a lot of the latter. We don't do so well at the former, and we need to do more of that synthesis before the analysis, I would contend. And we have to act as a critical friend, which is to say not the judge, jury, and sort of arbitrator, but rather somebody who is therefore dedicated to improvement in an honest way. Truth to power still should be the key watchword of evaluation, but you get your truth from your good friends. You don't necessarily get it from the judge and jury on the side. So can we do it, have both? I think we can. I think we can do that if we have integrity. None of these things suggest that we won't. In short, as Peter Senge, I'm stealing this shamelessly from him, when interviewed one time, he said, we need people to think more like a gardener and less like a mechanic. A mechanic says, well, we change this cog in the system and everything will work in a very mechanistic way. A gardener says, we're cultivating change. And in any true change, I think that's what it is. Humans are organisms, after all, biological organisms. We won't always be sure what we get, but we know that certain practices and principles are right. You need to have a certain amount of rainfall, a certain amount of sun, it has to grow with some soil. These are the things that we need to have as principles in doing evaluation, but not be slavishly bound to certain mechanisms or certain approaches as if they will automatically get us to a valid, reliable study. So in conclusion, I'm suggesting that we have current limitations, but that we can address these by seeing evaluation as more than an independent function. It can be a lens itself for public management, a way of thinking, something that we've discussed this morning. The second point is engage, engage, engage. Evaluation should be a team sport. It shouldn't be something done, again, by the cloistered few, by the experts, by the consultants. In fact, if those are the ways that we're practicing it, it's doomed to fail. It's got to have insights that can... Insights only work if they're shared. They only work if they're all co-owned, co-generated. And we can do that, ladies and gentlemen. It's way more fun to do it that way than it is to do it on your own in the back room somewhere. We need to integrate the approaches, the stakeholders and the processes for evaluation and management. And again, we need to act as facilitators, educators, critical friends. And then finally, we need to cultivate this change process, the process of evaluation itself, rather than believe that we can somehow mechanistically control it. With that, I'll take your questions. Thank you.